The night I rolled my trash can to the curb, I never imagined it would spark a full-blown neighborhood war. By sunrise, anonymous letters littered my porch, a board member had photographed my driveway, and a notice from the HOA threatened daily fines because of one supposed violation I didn't even understand. Every hour after that felt like a countdown, neighbors whispering, board members circling, rules twisting tighter. What secret power play was really hiding behind a single sheet of paper? And how far would they go to win? I'd lived on Maple Ridge Court for only 6 quiet months when I first sensed something strange about the neighborhood. From the outside, it looked like the perfect place to settle, tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, and neighbors who waved from their porches. My little brick house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, sunlight spilling across the yard each morning. After years of apartment living, it felt like a dream. Space to breathe, a garden to tend, and a garage big enough for weekend projects. The first weeks were blissfully uneventful. I planted herbs by the kitchen window, painted the guest room, and met a few friendly faces on evening walks. Retirees tended roses, kids biked in looping circles, and the HOA newsletter promised community harmony and shared pride. It sounded harmless, even comforting. Still, there were hints I couldn't ignore. A neighbor once mentioned, almost apologetically, that the board notices everything. Another joked that our HOA president, Mrs. Fowler, could spot a crooked mailbox from a mile away. I laughed it off. Every neighborhood has its quirks, right? Besides, I kept my lawn trimmed and obeyed the rules in the welcome packet to the letter. But small details started to nag at me. One afternoon, I caught the glint of a camera lens peeking through a hedge while I unloaded groceries. A week later, an envelope appeared on my porch with no stamp and no name. Just a printed note reminding me that garage doors must remain closed when not in active use. I chalked it up to neighborly overzealousness. Still, it felt like a warning. I told myself not to worry. I was careful, respectful, and boringly by the book. Yet each evening I'd notice the same car idling at the end of the cul-de-sac, lights off, engine barely humming. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe someone was just checking their phone. But something in the air shifted, as if the entire street was quietly holding its breath. What I didn't know was that a single, ordinary task, one I'd done 100 times without a second thought, would soon pull me straight into a battle I never saw coming. And the people who smiled at me in daylight? They were about to show just how far they'd go to keep their version of community harmony. The first official warning arrived like a punch to the gut. A plain white envelope slid under my door one morning, stamped with the HOA's crisp logo. Inside, a citation for garage door noncompliance and a $75 fine. According to the letter, my garage door had remained open beyond the permissible time frame, a phrase that sounded like it belonged in a courtroom, not a quiet cul-de-sac. I stared at the paper, replaying the previous evening in my mind. I'd unloaded groceries and closed the door within minutes. How could that possibly count as a violation? I marched outside, hoping to talk to someone face to face. But the street was empty, except for Mrs. Fowler's pale blue sedan creeping past at a snail's pace. Her eyes flicked toward me before she turned the corner. That night I installed a small camera above my driveway. Nothing fancy, just enough to prove when the door opened and closed. It felt excessive, but a quiet unease had taken root. 2 days later, a second letter appeared, a $150 fine for unapproved modifications, citing the visible placement of a security camera. Apparently, I'd broken another rule by trying to protect myself. I tried reasoning with the board. Emails went unanswered. Calls were redirected to a voicemail box that was full. When I finally caught Mrs. Fowler outside, her polite smile froze as soon as I mentioned the letters. "I'm sure the board has their reasons," she said, her voice dripping with finality. Then she turned away, leaving me mid-sentence. Within a week, the situation worsened. My mailbox filled with notices, grass too long by half an inch, trash cans visible for more than 3 minutes, even a $25 penalty for excessive decorative lighting, which referred to a single solar lantern by my walkway. Each fine felt more absurd than the last, as if someone were inventing violations just to see how far they could push. Neighbors began keeping their distance. Conversations that once stretched across driveways now ended with quick nods. A friend down the street admitted, in a hushed phone call, that the board had circulated a memo calling me non-compliant and warning that community standards must be preserved. The pressure was deliberate. Late one night, I heard tires crunching over gravel and caught the faint flash of a camera in my side yard. By the time I stepped outside, the street was empty. My own home, once a sanctuary, felt like a trap. I started documenting everything: timestamps, photos, letters, each entry a small act of defiance. Still, the board escalated. A certified notice arrived demanding I appear at a disciplinary hearing or face a lien on my property. The date was set for the following Tuesday, less than 48 hours away. Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake imagining worst-case scenarios: outrageous fees, threats of foreclosure, and the humiliation of a public spectacle. I knew they wanted me rattled, but I also knew I had rights. Somewhere in the thick binder of HOA bylaws, there had to be a limit to their power. On the morning of the hearing, I found my driveway blocked by a strange car. A silver SUV idled with its lights off, the driver hidden behind tinted glass. I waited, heart hammering, until it finally rolled away, slowly, almost mockingly. Inside the community center, the hearing felt more like an ambush. 3 board members sat in a row behind folding tables, papers stacked like ammunition. Mrs. Fowler presided at the center, her smile a thin blade. They listed every supposed violation, each fine recited in a rehearsed monotone. I presented my evidence, the camera footage proving my garage door was never left open, photos of neatly trimmed grass, but they barely glanced at it. "Community standards are not up for debate," Mrs. Fowler said, tapping her pen like a gavel. "Failure to comply will result in further action, including but not limited to property liens." My pulse roared in my ears. "You can't put a lien on a house over phantom rules," I managed, though my voice trembled. Her eyes gleamed. "We have that authority." The room felt smaller, the air thinner. For a moment, I thought I might actually lose my home because I'd dared to stand up for myself. But I also caught something in her expression. An overconfidence, as if she never expected pushback. I left with a folder full of bogus fines and a deadline: pay in 10 days or face escalated enforcement. That night, I pored over state HOA statutes, highlighting every clause that limited board power. The more I read, the more glaring their overreach became. They were bluffing, but I needed proof strong enough to stop them cold. 3 nights later, a pounding at my door yanked me awake. Flashing red and blue lights flooded my living room. 2 police officers stood on the porch, hands resting near their belts. "We received a report of stolen property," one said. My heart plummeted. They claimed a neighbor alleged I had illegally removed a vehicle from my own garage, an accusation so absurd it was almost laughable. Almost. I showed them the title, the registration, and the security footage. After an awkward pause, the officers exchanged glances and left, muttering about a misunderstanding, but I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. Someone had called 911 hoping to intimidate me, maybe even get me arrested. That was the moment the quiet dread hardened into resolve. I wasn't just dealing with petty fines anymore. This was harassment, pure and simple. And if the board thought they could scare me into silence, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The morning of the community's quarterly HOA meeting arrived gray and heavy, as if the weather itself sensed the storm brewing. For weeks, I'd collected evidence: timestamps, recorded calls, and state statutes highlighted in neon yellow. I was done reacting. This time I was walking in prepared. When I entered the clubhouse, a hush fell over the room. Rows of folding chairs were already filled. Neighbors I'd waved to for months now avoided my eyes. At the front sat the entire board, flanked by thick binders and a single microphone like it was a courtroom. Mrs. Fowler, pristine in a cream suit, gave me the faintest smile, a predator acknowledging prey. I took a seat near the aisle, heart hammering. A gavel cracked against wood. "This meeting will come to order," Mrs. Fowler announced, her voice smooth and commanding. One by one, Agenda items ticked by until she reached the line she'd clearly been waiting for. Next, property at 18 Maple Ridge Court, continued violations and unpaid fines. All eyes turned toward me. I stood, clutching my folder. "Before you proceed," I said, "I have documentation to present." My voice surprised me. Steady, almost calm. Mrs. Fowler's smile thinned. "You may speak, but the board has already reviewed the matter." "I doubt that," I replied, sliding copies of my evidence onto the table. "Because if you had, you'd know every fine you issued violates our own bylaws and state HOA statutes." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. I held up photographs and camera footage. Garage door closed within the allowed time, lawn measurements within spec, and even a time-stamped video of the night police were called for a stolen car that sat plainly in my driveway. Gasps came from the back row. Mrs. Fowler's jaw tightened. "These meetings are not for—" "They are," I interrupted, "when the board uses its position to harass a homeowner. Section 4, Article 12 of our charter states any member may present evidence of misconduct. And here's the state statute," I said, raising a highlighted page, "limiting HOA power to levy fines without clear, documented violations." For the first time, she hesitated. A man in the audience stood. "Is this true?" he asked the board. Another neighbor joined him. Murmurs swelled into a low rumble. The carefully controlled atmosphere cracked. Mrs. Fowler tried to regain control, her voice sharpening. "This is out of order." I didn't back down. "What's out of order is calling the police with a false report of theft. That's harassment and a criminal offense. I have the case number right here." I placed the incident report on the table like a trump card. The room erupted. Neighbors whispered, some pulling out their phones. A board member 2 seats down shifted uncomfortably, refusing to meet her gaze. I pressed on. "The board has 10 days to rescind these fines, or I'll file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory agency. I've also consulted an attorney about a civil harassment suit. Every piece of evidence you need to see is in this folder, and copies are already with my lawyer." Mrs. Fowler's composure faltered for the first time. Her lips thinned to a colorless line. "This is unnecessary." "No," I said, my voice rising over the chatter. "What's unnecessary is terrorizing your own community for personal control." Someone in the audience clapped, just once, but it cut through the tension like a starter pistol. Then another joined and another until the entire room pulsed with a low, steady applause. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough. The power dynamic shifted in an instant. A different board member, a middle-aged man I barely knew, cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said cautiously, "we should table this matter and review the documentation." Mrs. Fowler shot him a glare sharp enough to cut glass, but the moment was gone. The board whispered among themselves. After a brief, tense pause, the man turned back to the crowd. "The board will suspend all fines pending an internal review." The room buzzed. Relief and vindication washed through me, but I stayed rooted, refusing to show it. "And the false police report?" I asked. Mrs. Fowler wouldn't meet my eyes. "We'll address that internally," she muttered. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. The queen bee of Maple Ridge Court had been cornered, and everyone knew it. I left the meeting to a mixture of pats on the back and hushed questions. Some neighbors apologized for staying silent. Others offered quiet thanks. But I noticed Mrs. Fowler lingering by the doorway, speaking in quick, clipped tones to a fellow board member, her face pale and drawn. Outside, the cool evening air felt electric. I should have felt pure triumph, but adrenaline kept my thoughts spinning. This wasn't over. People like Mrs. Fowler rarely surrender without a final move. Sure enough, when I reached my driveway, a plain white envelope lay on the welcome mat, hand-delivered while I was at the meeting. No stamp, no name, just a single line of text inside. "This isn't finished." The words sent a chill straight through me. I looked up and scanned the quiet street. Porch lights flickered on in the distance, shadows stretching long across the pavement. Somewhere, unseen eyes might still be watching. I folded the note carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and locked the door behind me. They thought intimidation would break me. Instead, it steeled every resolve I had. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, the neighborhood knew exactly who was winning. The note sat on my kitchen counter for days, a single line of menace that seemed to hum with quiet threat. This isn't finished. I photographed it, bagged it like evidence, and slid it into a folder already bulging with letters, fines, and screenshots. Whatever Mrs. Fowler or whoever left it had planned, I wouldn't let fear dictate the next move. The morning after the stormy HOA meeting, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who'd avoided me for weeks stopped by with coffee, cookies, or simply a quiet word of support. Mr. Alvarez from 3 doors down offered to mow my lawn if I ever needed help. Retiree couple Sheila and David left a handwritten note. "You're not alone anymore." The tension that once clung to the cul-de-sac began to loosen. It was as if exposing the board's tactics had broken an unspoken spell. People started comparing notes, little incidents of intimidation or unfair fines they'd kept to themselves out of fear. Each story mirrored my own: unexplained fees, anonymous complaints, surprise inspections. We realized that the harassment wasn't personal. It was systemic. Within a week, a small coalition formed. We called ourselves the Residents' Voice. At first, it was just 6 households meeting in living rooms, but soon nearly half the neighborhood joined. Together, we drafted a petition demanding a full audit of the HOA's finances, open elections, and a revision of the bylaws to limit the board's unilateral power. Mrs. Fowler ignored our first letter. She ignored the second. But silence only fueled our momentum. I followed through with the lawyer I'd consulted before the meeting. After reviewing the evidence, including the anonymous note and the false police report, he recommended 2 parallel actions: formal complaint to the state's HOA, regulatory agency for illegal fines and harassment, a civil harassment claim naming the board, collectively and Mrs. Fowler individually. The mere filing of those papers had immediate effects. The regulatory agency requested documents from the HOA within 30 days. Our attorney sent a notice of pending litigation to the board, warning them to preserve all records. 3 board members resigned quietly within a week. Mrs. Fowler did not. Instead, she called an emergency meeting, her attempt at damage control. This time the clubhouse overflowed. Neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls and spilled out the doorway, phones ready to record. I didn't need to speak. The crowd did it for me, demanding answers, asking where dues had gone, why fines were levied without votes, and why police were involved in trivial disputes. When she tried to gavel, the meeting closed. Someone shouted, "You don't get to walk away this time!" Applause thundered through the room. The board voted on the spot to hold a recall election. The recall campaign became a neighborhood awakening. Yard signs sprouted like spring tulips. Vote for transparency. New board. New start. Neighbors who had barely nodded at one another were suddenly sharing late-night strategy sessions and homemade cookies. I stayed focused on the bigger picture. It wasn't about replacing one personality with another. It was about rewriting the rules. We proposed a new set of bylaws, clear limits on fines, mandatory documentation of violations, and a requirement that all board meetings be recorded and publicly posted. Election night felt surreal. Ballots were counted under bright fluorescent lights as dozens of residents watched. When the final tally was announced, cheers erupted. The entire old board, including Mrs. Fowler, had been voted out. She slipped out a side door before the last cheer faded. Aftermath and accountability, or complaint to the state agency, concluded a month later. The findings were blunt: multiple violations of state HOA law, including improper fines, lack of transparency, and abuse of authority. The agency levied penalties on the former board and ordered full reimbursement of every unjust fine, with interest. As for the civil claim, my